A senior Ripple researcher walked into a boardroom recently, 20-plus executive and non-executive bank directors sitting around the table. The session was scheduled for 30 minutes. It ran for 90, and here is the part that matters. These were not crypto enthusiasts. These were not tech-forward fintech founders. These were bank directors, the people who control some of the largest pools of institutional capital in the world. And at the end of that 90-minute session, the Ripple researcher described something that stopped me cold when I read it. He said the conversation has officially shifted from why to how. Not why should we consider digital assets? Not why does XRP matter? Just how do we integrate this? And when can we go live? That is not the beginning of an institutional adoption story. That is the middle of one. And most of the retail market has absolutely no idea it is already happening. While you have been watching the price and waiting for confirmation, the confirmation has been quietly assembling inside boardrooms you will never see. Today I'm going to show you exactly what that means, and why the window you are sitting in right now is the one you will remember for the rest of your financial life. Welcome back to Common Sense Crypto. I'm Rich. No hype, no price calls with dates attached, no doom and gloom when the market dips. This channel exists to give you the calm, rational, structural analysis that cuts through the noise. Because in markets, the noise is almost always designed to separate you from your position right before the move. Today we are breaking down three things. What the Digital Asset Clarity Act actually unlocks in mathematical terms, what the Bitwise CEO just revealed about the pace of bank adoption, and why the current period of apparent stalling is, if you know how to read institutional behavior, the most bullish signal this cycle has produced. Let's get into it. Let me start with the hard truth that most people in this space have still not fully internalized. Every single bullish catalyst that has ever been discussed around XRP, banks integrating the XRP ledger, institutional capital flooding into the asset, Ripple becoming the infrastructure of the new global financial system, none of it happens without regulatory clarity. Not a single dollar of it. And I want to be precise about why, because this is where the retail crowd gets it wrong. They think regulatory clarity is just a formality, a box to check, something that matters to lawyers but not to markets. That is completely backwards. Here is the hidden mechanism. When you are managing $9 trillion in assets, and yes, I'm going to use Morgan Stanley as the example because they just filed for a national trust bank charter, you do not deploy into a new asset class without legal certainty. It is not about risk appetite. It is about fiduciary obligation. The people managing institutional capital are legally required to operate within defined regulatory frameworks. They cannot choose to ignore that even if they want to. Their compliance departments will not allow it. Their boards will not allow it. Their regulators will not allow it. So when retail sees the Clarity Act stalling in Congress and reads that as nothing is happening, the institutions see the Clarity Act approaching the finish line and read that as get your infrastructure ready. Because the second the bill passes, the legal barrier that has been keeping institutional capital on the sideline does not gradually lower. It drops all the way overnight. Think about what that means in terms of preparation time. The institutions that are ready on day one, the ones that already have their custody infrastructure built, their compliance frameworks aligned, their internal education completed, their product teams trained, those institutions capture the first mover advantage in the largest asset reallocation event in modern financial history. The institutions that are not ready scramble to catch up and pay higher prices doing it. This is why Morgan Stanley filed for a national trust bank charter before the Clarity Act passed. This is why bank directors are spending 90 minutes instead of 30 in XRP infrastructure briefings. This is why Bitwise CEO Hunter Horsley said one major US bank went from zero to full speed on crypto in months, not years, and described their leadership team going from 0 to 500 miles per hour on crypto education and rollout. 500 miles per hour. His words. And then Horsley said, banks don't move like that. Ever. Let that land for a second. One of the most respected voices in institutional crypto said that what he is witnessing from traditional banks right now violates every assumption anyone has ever made about how conservative financial institutions move. And he is not describing one outlier. He said he is hearing the same thing across the entire industry. The conversation has shifted from why to how. The preparation is happening. The infrastructure is being staged. The institutions are at the starting line. The Clarity Act is the starting gun. Now let's build the numbers that make this concrete, because this is where the thesis stops being analytical and becomes irrefutable. The foreign exchange market processes $7.5 trillion per day. Every day, the cross-border payments market moves approximately $150 trillion annually. And locked inside the correspondent banking system that facilitates both of those flows are roughly $27 trillion in Nostro and Vostro accounts. Pre-funded currency buffers sitting idle in banks around the world, doing nothing except guaranteeing that the next transaction can settle. $27 trillion, sitting still, earning nothing, locked in place because the current settlement infrastructure requires it as a buffer against the inefficiency of T+2 settlement cycles. 2 business days to settle a transaction that should take 3 seconds. XRP eliminates that buffer requirement entirely. On-demand liquidity does not need pre-funded accounts. It does not need T+2. It needs a liquid XRP market and a connection to the XRP ledger. Both exist today, and the moment regulatory clarity makes it legally safe for banks to deploy ODL at institutional scale, that $27 trillion in locked capital does not gradually thaw. It begins to move. JP Morgan, and I know some of you do not trust JP Morgan's intentions, I understand that completely, but you do not have to trust their intentions to trust their math. JP Morgan formally stated that the Digital Asset Clarity Act could be the catalyst that unlocks institutional capital and drives significant upside in the second half of 2026. When the largest bank in the United States by assets makes that statement on record, it is not because someone at JP Morgan is a crypto enthusiast. It is because their analysts have run the numbers and the numbers point in one direction. Here's the math that retail consistently ignores. If just 1% of that $27 trillion in locked Nostro Vostro capital begins moving through XRP-based corridors, just 1%, the most conservative possible scenario, that is $270 billion in new demand flowing into a fixed supply asset with approximately 55 to 57 billion tokens in circulation. The circulating supply is not expanding meaningfully. The OTC float is compressing. Exchange reserves are declining month over month, and institutional demand, currently staged but not yet deployed, is about to receive its legal clearance. Fixed supply, compressing float, incoming institutional demand. Those 3 variables do not produce a modest price move. They produce a structural repricing. And Horsley's estimate that 2/3 of all financial institutions will be active in crypto within 6 months, combined with his observation that over half of all fintechs and neobanks are already moving in right now, tells you that the demand side of this equation is not a future projection. It is a current reality accelerating toward a regulatory trigger. This is not a prediction. It is the logical mathematical outcome of a system that was purpose-built for exactly this moment. Let me show you the institutional behavior in concrete terms, because the pattern here is not subtle once you know what to look for. Morgan Stanley manages $9.3 trillion in assets across 18 million clients. They have filed for a national trust bank charter, a federally chartered entity overseen by the OCC, held to the highest institutional fiduciary standards in the U.S. financial system. They did not do this as an experiment. They did not do this to stay relevant with younger clients. They did this because their legal team has given them the green light to build the infrastructure that will hold digital assets under a federal charter. And their business development team has identified the client demand that will flow into those custody products the moment regulatory clarity confirms the pathway. Morgan Stanley prior commentary has already flagged XRP as a potential swift alternative. That is not a coincidence. That is a strategic signal from an institution that does not make careless statements about specific assets. And then there is the Bitwise data point that I think is the most underreported signal of this entire cycle. Bitwise CEO Hunter Horsley did not describe gradual, cautious institutional interest. He described a sprint, a major U.S. bank, 25-year veteran executive, full leadership team, going from complete inactivity to maximum speed on crypto integration in under 2 months. Horsley specifically said banks do not move like that. And yet, here we are. The behavior that historically has never been observed in traditional banking is now being observed across multiple institutions simultaneously. What changed? The legal landscape changed. The Ripple versus SEC resolution changed the legal calculus for every institution that had been watching from the sideline. The National Trust Bank charter applications from Morgan Stanley from others changed the competitive calculus. And the Clarity Act approaching the finish line is changing the deployment calculus. When compliance says we have a framework, the capital that has been staged begins to move. Brad Garlinghouse put it precisely this week. The door to a deal is wide open. The banks just need to act in good faith and walk through it. That is the posture of a CEO who is not negotiating from weakness. That is a CEO who has built the infrastructure, secured the partnerships, and is holding the door open while the other side finishes getting their legal teams aligned. And David Sachs from the White House has directly confirmed that the brokering process between the banking sector and the crypto industry is moving forward, describing the legislative work as extraordinary. When the White House crypto advisor is characterizing the process in those terms, the bill is not dying. It is being assembled. The institutions are not hoping this works out. They are building for it. There is a difference, and that difference is visible in every charter filing, every boardroom session that runs 30 minutes over schedule, and every bank executive who has stopped asking why and started asking how. Let me be specific about the window and why it matters beyond just regulations are coming eventually. The current target window for the Digital Asset Clarity Act is the second half of 2026. JP Morgan is publicly aligned with that timeline. The legislative machinery, messy as it looks on the surface, is in motion. But here is the timing pressure that most people are not factoring in: midterm elections. If the Clarity Act does not pass before the midterms, you introduce the risk of a congressional reshuffle, a rewrite, a delay, a process that could push meaningful clarity into 2027 or 2028. That is not a theoretical risk. That is a documented historical pattern. Major financial legislation that stalls at an election cycle boundary tends to get pushed back significantly, which means the political pressure to close this deal in the second half of 2026 is at its highest point in this entire legislative cycle. The Fed is signaling alignment. The FDIC has moved toward a compatible posture. The OCC is moving in the same direction. Every major regulatory body is pointing toward the same outcome. The friction point, the banking lobby's resistance to stablecoin yield and certain market structure provisions, is real, but it is the last friction point, not the first. When that last friction point breaks, the capital does not trickle in. It floods, and the institutions that are currently at the starting line, charters filed, infrastructure built, boards educated, compliance frameworks aligned, they go first, at whatever price is there when they arrive. That price will not be the price you see today. Let me talk about what the accumulation window actually looks like from the data, because sentiment and price can be misleading. On-chain behavior is harder to fake. Exchange reserves for XRP are not expanding. They are contracting. Month after month, the supply of XRP sitting on centralized exchanges available for immediate retail purchase gets smaller. The coins leaving exchanges are not going to short-term traders. They are going into cold storage, into long-term holding wallets, institutional custodians, and multi-signature vaults. Coins that go into those structures do not come back to market for a 10 or 15% profit. They are positioned for a different price environment entirely. The OTC float, the supply available to large buyers who want to accumulate without moving the visible spot market, is in its final compression phase based on available analyst data. When that supply is absorbed, the next institutional buyer has to go to the open market. And when an institution the size of Morgan Stanley's digital asset division goes to the open market for a fixed supply asset with a contracting exchange float, the price discovery event is not gentle. The retail market right now is being offered a pricing window that the institutional sprint Horsley described will close permanently once the Clarity Act passes and the deployment begins. The great pricing out does not send you a calendar invite. It happens while the crowd is still debating whether anything is ever going to happen. Buy what you can afford, accumulate consistently, secure your holdings properly, and recognize that what feels like waiting is actually the last stretch of the preparation phase, not the beginning of a longer delay. I want to speak directly to the people who have been holding through everything this cycle has thrown at them. The delays, the legislative theater, the headlines about banking lobbies blocking progress, the months where XRP just followed Bitcoin sideways, while every piece of underlying news was screaming bullish, the social media noise telling you to give up, the coworkers asking if you still hold that crypto. You are not wrong. You are early, and right now, early and wrong look identical from the outside. They always do. Right up until the moment the institutions that have been quietly building their positions at your price points go live, and the market finally sees what you have been seeing for months. The pattern here is not new. The Ripple SEC lawsuit looked like existential risk for years. The people who held through it were vindicated. The Clarity Act delay looks like stalling. The institutions moving at 500 miles per hour inside boardrooms you cannot see suggests otherwise. Your patience is not a character flaw. In this market, it is the edge. Let me close this out clearly, because I want you to walk away from this video with a complete picture. The Clarity Act is the master key. Without it, every bullish thesis around XRP stays theoretical. With it, every institutional position that has been staged but not yet deployed gets the legal green light simultaneously. The bill is not a nice to have. It is the prerequisite for every downstream development. Bank integration, ETF inflows, ODL at institutional scale, the release of the $27 trillion Nostro Vostro lock, all of it. The institutions are not waiting to see if this works. They are staging for when it works. Morgan Stanley is filing charters. Bank directors are running 90-minute briefings that were scheduled for 30. Bitwise is watching banks move at speeds they have never seen before in traditional finance. Senior Ripple researchers are walking out of boardrooms where the question has stopped being why and become how. That is not the beginning of this story. That is the middle. And the retail market, the same retail market that is frustrated by the price, selling out of exhaustion, checking charts every hour for a move that has not happened yet. That retail market is sitting in the exact window that institutional smart money has been counting on staying open long enough to finish their positioning. The question is not whether this happens. The data says it is happening. The question is whether you are positioned before the Clarity Act passes or after, before the Morgan Stanley crypto custody product goes live or after. Before 2/3 of financial institutions activate their digital asset strategies, or after. Price is the distraction, structure is the reality, and the structure of the global financial system is being rebuilt around digital asset rails in real time. XRP is the settlement layer of that rebuild. The institutions already know it. The boardrooms already know it. Now you know it too. Drop Floodgate in the comments if you made it to the end of this one. I want to see who is watching the structure and not just the price. This is Common Sense Crypto. I'm Rich. Stay patient, stay rational. And as always, we don't wait for the future. We plan for it. See you in the next one. Have a great night.